Real violence doesn't sound like the movies. There is no swelling orchestral score, no crisp Foley effects of fists hitting leather. There is just the wet, sickening snap of connective tissue giving way and the desperate, ragged sound of air leaving lungs. It is quiet, ugly, and entirely governed by physics. I stood on the mat in the Little Creek Dojo, the air thick with the smell of stale sweat, rubber, and the industrial disinfectant that the Navy uses to scrub away the evidence of effort. It was 90 degrees in the room, the humidity clinging to the skin like a second layer of clothing. But my internal temperature was regulating. I was holding the wrist of a young SEAL candidate, Miller, 22, heavy on the bench press, light on the mechanics. He was holding the training knife like a hammer. "Thumb here cuts your tendon," I said. My voice was low, flat, cutting through the ambient noise of 50 other pairs sparring in the background. I didn't scold him. I simply adjusted his grip, moving the thumb from the spine of the blade to the flat. If you strike a rib with a hammer grip, the blade stops. Your hand keeps moving. The blade slides back. You sever your own flexor pollicis longus. You disarm yourself before the enemy touches you. Miller looked at his hand, then at me. He was trying to reconcile the visual data, a 135-pound female civilian instructor, with the lethal mechanics I was explaining. He nodded, sweating. Then the ambient noise in the room died. It didn't taper off. It was severed. The silence started at the double doors and rolled across the mat like a wave. I didn't need to turn around to know who had entered. The displacement of air in the room changed. Master Chief Bronson Kane walked onto the floor, flanked by 3 of his team. Kane was 6'4", 240 pounds of dense muscle and institutional authority. He moved with the heavy, rolling gait of a man who knows the ground will always yield to him. He didn't look at the candidates. He looked at me. It was a predator's gaze, unblinking, devoid of social niceties, measuring the distance between his violence and my compliance. He stopped 10 feet away. The silence was now absolute. 200 operators were watching, their breathing shallow. "This was theatre show me," Kane said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to, "You're teaching blade mechanics," demonstrate on a resisting opponent. Not a kid, he stepped onto the mat. He wasn't wearing protective gear. He was wearing his fatigues and a smile that looked like a shark breaking the surface of the water. He held his hands up, palms open, mocking, "Come on, Ghost. Let's see if the department's money is wasted." He gave me 3 seconds to run. I didn't run. I ran the calculation. 240 pounds versus 135. In a static contest of strength, I lose every time. In biomechanics, however, mass is just leverage waiting to be borrowed. I needed to drop my center of gravity. I needed to wait for him to overcommit. Kane lunged. It wasn't a spar, it was an assault. He covered the 10 feet in 2 strides, leading with a grappling hook of a right hand intended to tear fabric and crush the clavicle underneath. He generated force from his back foot, committing his entire mass to the forward vector. It was a mistake. He assumed I would retreat. I didn't. I stepped into the arc. I smelled him then. Tobacco, gun oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of aggression. I intercepted his wrist with my left hand, not to block the force, but to redirect it. At the same moment, I rotated my hips, driving the heel of my right palm upward in a tight, kinetic chain. I did not aim for the jaw. The jaw is bone. Bone breaks, but the adrenaline keeps the machine running. I aimed for the mandibular angle, the soft bundle of nerves tucked just below the ear. The impact was precise. It wasn't a thud. It was the sharp, percussive crack of high-velocity energy transfer. Vestibular disruption is immediate. Kane's eyes rolled back before his brain could process the trauma. His neurological system pulled the emergency brake. His knees unlocked. He didn't stumble. He collapsed. He fell like a condemned building, straight down, heavy and final. The sound of 240 pounds of dead weight hitting the rubber mat shook the floorboards. Then, the silence returned, heavier than before. It was the vacuum that follows a catastrophic structural failure. 200 operators stared. No one cheered. No one clapped. In this community, you do not applaud violence. You study it, or you fear it. Kane lay motionless, his breathing ragged but present. I stood over him, my chest heaving slightly, my heart rate holding steady at 140. I forced it down. Inhale for 4. Exhale for 4. I dropped to one knee, checking his airway, then his carotid. Strong pulse. He would wake up with a headache and a compromised reputation. My wrist ached from the redirect, a joint cost echoing Lucas's last unbalanced equation. Vestibular disruption, I said to the room, my tone clinical, as if I were reading a weather report. The brain cannot orient gravity. The body shuts down to protect the spine. I stood up and adjusted my left sleeve. There was a red welt forming on my wrist where Kane's uniform had scraped me. The pain was sharp, a high-frequency sting, but pain is just data. I filed it away. I looked at Miller, who was staring at me as if I were a different species. Class dismissed. I turned and walked toward the exit, my steps measured, my face blank. I did not look back at the fallen giant. I left the room with the quiet dignity of someone who had simply balanced an equation. The welt on my wrist linked to later costs in the swamp and yacht. The adrenaline dump is a chemical tax the body pays for survival. It usually hits 20 minutes after the event, but mine was arriving early. My hands were steady, trained steadiness, but there was a cold, tightening sensation in my lower back, a phantom echo of the kinetic energy I had just channeled. I walked down the long, fluorescent-lit corridor of the administrative block. The air here was different from the dojo. It was scrubbed, filtered, and chilled to a precise 68 degrees. It smelled of ozone from the copiers, burnt coffee, and the subtle, pervasive scent of bureaucracy. My wrist throbbed in time with my heartbeat, a reminder of the friction burn from Kane's fatigues. I pulled my sleeve down further. I reached the secure door that separated the training wing from the command offices. I pulled my keycard from my lanyard, a simple white plastic rectangle that defined my existence on this base. I tapped it against the reader. I expected the chirping beep and the mechanical clack of the maglock disengaging. Instead, the LED on the reader flashed a hard, unforgiving red. A low buzz, like an angry insect, signaled denial. I paused. I tapped it again. Red. I looked at the small LCD screen above the reader. Text scrolled across it in jagged green pixels. Credential invalid. See security officer. I didn't curse. I didn't hit the door. I stood perfectly still. Retaliation in the modern military isn't always a fist to the face. Sometimes, it's a line of code changed in a server room miles away. It's a permission error. It's being erased from the system while you're still standing inside it. Commander Victoria Reyes exited her office 10 yards down the hall. She saw me standing at the door. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She checked the folder in her hand, adjusted her glasses, and walked toward me with the brisk efficiency of someone who wants to keep a conversation under 30 seconds. She stopped, just out of arm's reach. Her eyes flicked to the camera dome on the ceiling, then back to me. "Your access has been flagged," Reyes said. Her voice was low. Stripped of the camaraderie we had shared during the briefing yesterday, the system has you marked as a security risk. It's pending a Level 3 review. Incident report auto-triggers Level 3 hold on whose authority? I asked. My voice was calm, matching hers. It's automated. Sarah. An incident report was filed regarding the demo in the dojo. Assault on a superior officer. She paused, her expression tightening. Don't fight the algorithm today. Don't make noise. Go back to your quarters. Let the system process it. She walked away before I could answer, effectively dismissing me. Let the system process it. That was the trap. If I waited, the review would drag on for weeks. In that time, the data I needed, the logs, the transfer orders, would be scrubbed. I needed to see the network. Now. I turned and headed for the IT support kiosk near the vending machines. It was manned by a petty officer, 3rd class, young, bored, staring at a phone hidden behind a stack of paperwork. His name tag read Jenkins. He looked like he hadn't seen the sun in days. This was the weak link. I shifted my posture. I rounded my shoulders, let my face soften from instructor to confused contractor. I approached the desk, exhaling loudly enough to catch his attention. "Hey," I said, offering a tired, apologetic smile. "I think I messed up my card." Again, Jenkins looked up, blinking. "Ma'am, I had it next to my phone. Or maybe a magnet in my bag. It's not reading." I placed the card on the counter, sliding it toward him. "I'm supposed to be logging hours for the field exercise prep, and my supervisor is going to kill me if I show up late with a dog ate my homework." Excuse, he sighed. The universal sound of IT support everywhere. "Let me check." He took the card and swiped it through his keyboard reader. I leaned against the counter, casual, projecting boredom. But my eyes were locked on his monitor. I watched the reflection in the plexiglass divider. "Yeah, it's flagged," Jenkins mumbled. "Says security risk." That's weird. Usually it just says, "read error," if it's demagnetized. "Great," I said, injecting a note of panic. "Can you just print the error log?" "Just the code. So I can show them it's the system's fault, not mine. I just need to prove I tried to clock in. I'm not really supposed to print admin logs for contractors," he wavered Jenkins. "Please. I just dropped a guy in the dojo. I'm exhausted, and I really don't want to get written up for being late." The mention of the dojo fight perked him up. "The rumor mill traveled faster than fiber optics. That was you." "The one who dropped Master Chief Kane." He looked at me with new interest. "He slipped," I said. "Just the log." "Jenkins. Please." He shrugged and hit Control-P. The laser printer hummed. I watched the page spool out. I didn't look at the error code. I looked at the line item just above it, the one that showed my current active duty status. It wasn't pending review. It was a movement order. Subject, Vance, S. Assignment, field exercise. Location, Dismal Swamp. Sector 4 live fire. I took the paper from him. My hand didn't shake. "Thanks. Jenkins." "You're a lifesaver," I walked away, the paper crumpling slightly in my grip. Sector 4. A live fire zone. They weren't just locking me out. They were moving me to a coordinate where accidents were statistically probable. The paper war had started, and my invite to the kill box had just been printed. The humidity in the great dismal swamp does not simply exist. It occupies space, pressing against the lungs with the weight of wet wool. It was day 10 of my time at Little Creek, and the paper war had escalated into kinetic movement. The transfer order Jenkins had printed was not a suggestion. It was a vector. I stood ankle-deep in black. Stagnant water, the kind that smells of ancient rot and sulphur. My wrist still carried the ghost of the friction burn from the dojo, a dull throb that synchronized with the squelch of boots in the mud. Sector 4 was designated a live fire zone. The sign at the perimeter had been explicit, a white rectangle with bold red lettering that promised death for non-compliance. I was not here alone. I was embedded with a squad of trainees, led by a petty officer named Mercer. Mercer was Kane's creature. I had seen it in the way he moved, the way he looked at me. He wasn't leading us through a navigation exercise. He was herding us. His eyes were constantly scanning not the terrain, but me, waiting for the system's promise to be fulfilled. The air was heavy with more than just moisture. It held the metallic taste of anticipation. We had been walking for 3 hours. The route Mercer chose was nonsensical, a winding path through the densest part of the mire, avoiding the hard-packed trails that would have made tactical sense. He was isolating us. I watched the squad, 6 young men, exhausted, their faces streaked with mud and confusion. They knew something was wrong, but the chain of command is a powerful blinder. They followed Mercer because the uniform told them to. I followed because I needed to see the shape of the trap before I could dismantle it. I reached into my webbing and touched the cold plastic of the satellite beacon. It was my lifeline, the standard issue panic button for training accidents. If pressed, it would broadcast a distress signal to the command center, overriding local protocols. I didn't press it. I needed to know if it would even work. I slid it out, shielding the small LCD screen with my body. No signal. The bars were empty. Line of sight required, I whispered to myself. The canopy here was too thick, the terrain too depressed. The physics of RF transmission do not care about emergency protocols. In a deep swamp valley, a satellite beacon is just a paperweight. This wasn't an oversight. This was the design. They had moved me to a dead zone where a training accident would have a 20-minute head start on the rescue team. A sound cut through the heavy air, the sharp crack thump of a distant rifle shot. Then another. Live fire. But we weren't near the target range. The shots were coming from the north, the direction Mercer was leading us. The birds had stopped singing. That was the real warning. In nature, silence is the loudest alarm. A near-miss shot splintered bark nearby, forcing the squad to flinch. I stopped. The squad bumped into each other, halting in a ragged line. Mercer turned, his face flushed with heat and irritation. Keep moving. Vance. We're on a timetable. We're off course, I said. My voice was calm, but I let it carry the weight of an order. The range is north-northeast. You're walking us into the impact area. I have the GPS, Mercer snapped, tapping the device on his chest rig. I know where I'm going. Your GPS is failing, I said, pointing to the thick canopy. Look at the sky. Look at the water flow. We are walking into a kill box. Mercer stepped toward me. He was smaller than Kane, but he had the desperate aggression of a man who knows his career depends on following a dirty order. He put his hand on my shoulder, a shove masquerading as a guide. Move out, instructor. That's an order. I didn't shove back. I didn't strike. I simply stepped into his personal space, reducing the distance to 0. I looked at him. really looked at him with the dead eyes of someone who has seen what a 5.5 to 6 round does to soft tissue. If we walk another 100 yards, we are downrange. When the rounds start impacting, they won't check your rank. They will tear through you just as easily as they tear through me. Is that the order you were given? To die with me? Mercer froze. He saw it then, not the civilian instructor, but the ghost. He saw the calculation in my eyes, the absolute certainty that I would survive this and he might not. The humidity seemed to spike, sweat breaking instantly on his forehead. He looked at the squad, then back at the dark tree line where the gunshots echoed. "Check your azimuth," I said softly. "The sun. The canopy breaks 50 yards east. We go there." It was a moral choice for him. Obey the shadow order to get me killed, or disobey and live. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the sudden quiet. He nodded, once, a jerky motion. "East." He barked to the squad, his voice cracking slightly. "We're adjusting route. We moved east." I took point, not by asking, but by doing. As we broke through the brush, I felt the eyes of the swamp on my back. The trap had failed, but the intent was clear. They weren't just trying to fire me anymore. They were willing to spend lives to bury the truth. I adjusted my pack, the straps digging into my bruised shoulder. This wasn't training. This was war. The transition from the swamp to the officers' club was a violent shift in sensory input. The smell of rot and sulphur was replaced by expensive cologne, floor wax, and the roasted savour of prime rib. The humidity was gone, traded for the aggressive climate control that kept the ballroom at a crisp, sweat-free temperature. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen explosions, refracting the light into 1,000,000 diamonds that hurt eyes accustomed to the gloom of the mire. It was day 14. The gala was in full swing, a sea of dress whites and evening gowns, a theatre of politeness masking the brutal machinery of the military-industrial complex. I was not wearing a gown. I was wearing the standard black vest and white shirt of the catering staff, facing the room. Invisibility isn't about hiding. It's about being so boring that the human eye slides right off you. Grey man theory says, be the furniture, not the ghost. I moved through the crowd, a phantom in plain sight, weaving between admirals and senators who looked right through me to find the waiter with the shrimp puff. My target was Senator Clayton Rhodes. He was holding court near the centre of the room, a gravity well of charisma and power. He looked exactly like his photos, handsome, polished, with the kind of smile that costs $10,000. He was laughing at a joke made by a defense contractor, his hand resting casually on the lapel of his tuxedo. But I wasn't looking at his face. I was looking at his pocket, specifically the bulge of his wallet where his encrypted keycard lived. The device in my pocket, an NFC cloner rig disguised as a bulky smartphone, was warm against my thigh. It was a piece of hardware that could steal a digital identity in seconds. But physics demanded a price. The read range was pathetic. I needed to be less than 5 centimeters away, and I needed to stay there for 3 seconds. In the world of tradecraft, 3 seconds is an eternity. It is time enough to be noticed, to be questioned, to be caught. I adjusted my trajectory. I didn't walk straight at him. That triggers the predator response. I drifted, syncing my movement with the flow of the room, waiting for the gap in his security detail. A waiter with a tray is invisible, but a waiter who collides with a senator is a spectacle. I needed something in between. I needed a clumsy accident that felt entirely mundane. I saw my opening. Rhodes turned to greet a donor, stepping back slightly into the service lane. I accelerated, just a fraction. I timed my step to intersect with his elbow. As I reached the impact zone, I stumbled. It was a controlled failure of balance. I pitched forward, the tray tipping dangerously. "Whoa, easy there," Rhodes said, his reflex to steady me automatic. His hand caught my arm. I fell into him. Not a crash, but a heavy lean. I pressed my thigh against his hip, right over the pocket. The distance was 0. I triggered the cloner with a squeeze of my hand in my pocket. 1. I am so sorry, Senator. I gasped, my voice breathless, terrified. I kept my head down, playing the part of the mortified server. I felt his body stiffen, the recoil of a man who knows he doesn't like being touched by the help. 2. Watch where you're going, he said, his voice dropping an octave, the charm stripping away to reveal the steel beneath. He tried to push me back. I held my ground for a microsecond longer, feigning a loss of footing on the polished floor. 3. A tiny vibration against my legs signaled the capture. The LED on the device in my pocket turned green. I had his digital soul. I pulled back, flushing red, an easy physiological trick when your heart rate is 160. I'm so sorry, sir, I slipped. Rhodes brushed his jacket, his eyes cold, assessing. For a second, he looked at me. Really looked at me. He wasn't seeing a waiter anymore. He was seeing a variable he couldn't quite place. He registered the anomaly, his baseline shifted. His hand went to his cufflinks, twisting the gold metal a nervous tell. Go, he said, dismissing me with a wave. Get another tray. I bobbed a nod and retreated, vanishing back into the flow of black vests. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to crack my calm facade. I had the key. I had the access, but as I slipped through the kitchen doors, I felt the weight of his gaze still on my back. He didn't know what I had taken, but he knew I had touched him. The clock wasn't just ticking anymore. It was sprinting. The rusty anchor was less a bar and more a structural failure, held together by nicotine stains and salt air. Located 3 miles off the main strip of Virginia Beach, it was the kind of place where careers went to die quietly in the bottom of a plastic pitcher. The air conditioning unit in the corner rattled with a mechanical death rattle, fighting a losing war against the humidity and the smell of stale beer, fried grease, and damp wool. I sat in the back booth facing the door. My back was against the wall. A habit, not a choice. On the table in front of me sat a glass of club soda that had gone flat 20 minutes ago and a manila envelope that contained the end of a man's life. The door opened, admitting a slice of blinding afternoon sun that cut through the gloom like a laser. Master Chief Bronson Kane stepped inside, destroying the light as the door swung shut behind him. He looked smaller in civilian clothes, a grey hoodie and jeans, but he moved with the same heavy, displacement-focused gait I had felt on the dojo mat. He scanned the room. It took him 4 seconds to clear the corners, 2 seconds to assess the exits, and 1 second to find me. He walked over, pulling out the chair opposite mine. He didn't sit immediately. He loomed, blocking the ambient light, letting his shadow fall across the table. When he finally sat, the wood creaked under his 240 pounds. He placed his hands on the table, facing the door. Under the table, I heard the distinct metallic click of a holster retention strap disengaging. "You have 5 minutes," Kane said. His voice was gravel grinding on glass. "Then I walk out, and you get arrested for espionage. Unauthorized possession of a cloned credential is a federal crime, Vance. And murder is a capital offense," I replied. I didn't look at his hands. I looked at his eyes. The whites were yellowed, bloodshot. The pupils were dilated. Stress response. He wasn't here to arrest me. If he were, the Shore Patrol would be kicking down the door. He was here because he was terrified. "You're not here to arrest me, Bronson. You're here because Rhodes stopped taking your calls." His jaw muscle jumped a microspasm of the masseter. "Senator Rhodes is a patriot. Senator Rhodes is an architect," I corrected. "You're just the bricklayer. And when the building is done, you don't keep the bricklayer. You pay him off, or you bury him." I slid the manila envelope across the scarred wood. It moved smoothly through a ring of condensation left by a previous patron's beer. Page 3. Look at the transfer orders, signed this morning. Kane stared at the envelope. He didn't want to touch it. Touching it made it real. Finally, His left hand, the one not near the gun, reached out and flipped the cover. He read. I watched his eyes track the text. I watched the moment the data hit the cognitive processor. His breathing hitched. Sector 9 insertion. I narrated, my voice low, clinical. No support, no extraction plan, deniable assets only. That's not a deployment, Chief. In the language of the Pentagon, that is a suicide mission. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized by the hum of the neon sign buzzing above the bar. Kane read the line again. The paper shook slightly in his hand, a tremor of rage, or perhaps grief. He looked up at me. The predator was gone. In its place was a man realizing he had been guarding the door to his own execution chamber. He said he'd protect my pension, Kane whispered. He said he'd keep my daughter out of the fallout. He lied, I said. He's cleaning house, Bronson. You're loose ends. I'm loose ends. The only difference is, I saw it coming. I leaned forward, encroaching on his space, lowering my voice to a frequency that barely traveled past the table. You can die in Sector 9 next week, and your daughter gets a folded flag and a father who died in disgrace. Or you can help me finish this, and she gets a father who retired with his benefits intact. Kane looked at the gun under the table, then at me. He slowly moved his hand away from his waist, placing it on the table next to the other one. It was a surrender. It was a transaction. His fingers twitched once a hesitation between duty and survival. What do you need? He asked. The voice was hollow, defeated. I need access to the yacht, I said, and I need you to disappear until I call you. He nodded. Once. He stood up, leaving the envelope on the table. He looked at the door, then back at me. Be careful, Ghost. The Senator. He doesn't just kill people, he erases them. I know, I said. That's why I'm erasing him first. Kane turned and walked out. I watched him go, listening to the heavy thud of his boots fading into the parking lot. I didn't exhale. I picked up my flat soda and took a sip. It tasted like warm iron. I had turned the dog against the master, but the master still held the keys to the kennel. The interior of the rental sedan was a capsule of dead silence and artificial light. Parked in the shadow of a condemned warehouse near the docks, the car was invisible to the streetlights, a black void in a grey world. The dashboard clock read 02:14 a.m. The air inside was stale, smelling of the previous renter's cigarettes, and the sharp ozone tang of my electronics. My laptop was open on the passenger seat, facing the door. It hummed quietly, a digital heartbeat syncing with my own. I checked the signal strength on the burner phone. 5 bars. Encrypted tunnel established. I wasn't just making a call. I was constructing a trap. I typed the number for Senator Clayton Rhodes's private line, the one that bypassed his aides, his security detail, and the official record. I pressed send. The ringback tone was a digital purr. It rang once. Twice. Who is this? Rhodes' voice was thick with sleep, but the edge of command was instant. He didn't ask, hello. He demanded identity. You have a leak, Senator, I said. My voice was modulated, stripped of inflection, passing through a filter that flattened the pitch. And the water is rising. Vance, he said. He recognized me not by the voice, but by the audacity. There was a rustle of fabric sheets moving, a body sitting up. Do you have any idea what time it is? Do you have any idea who you are calling? I'm calling the man who ordered a suicide mission for his own head of security, I said. And I'm calling to tell you that the insurance policy Lucas left behind, it just vested. Lucas is dead, Rhodes snapped. And you're a fugitive. I can have a team at your location in 10 minutes. You don't know my location, I countered. But I know yours. And I know what's on your private server. I hit the enter key on my laptop. The file transfer bar filled from left to right in a single satisfying surge. Check your secure inbox, Senator. Look for Gabriel_log_01.enc. There was a silence on the line. It stretched 3 seconds, 4, 5. I could hear his breathing change. It shifted from the slow rhythm of sleep to the shallow, rapid intake of panic. I visualized him in his penthouse. The expensive silk sheets, the phone pressed to his ear, the sudden cold sweat breaking on his skin. He was checking. He was seeing the file name. He knew what it meant. "This is..." His voice cracked, just a fracture, before he welded it back together. "This is encrypted. You can't open it." "I don't need to open it," I lied. "It's a dead man's switch. If I don't enter a code every 12 hours, the key goes public. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the JAG Corps, everyone gets the key. Everyone sees how you used the activity to launder money." "That's bluff," he said, but the conviction was gone. He was calculating now. He was an architect, and he was realizing the foundation was liquefying. "Is it?" I asked. "Are you willing to bet your career on that? Your freedom? What do you want?" The question was a hiss. "A meeting," I said, "face to face. No security detail. No cameras. Just you and me. We negotiate the price of the key." "Where?" "Your yacht. The Sovereign. Tonight. 0300 hours. "The yacht?" He hesitated. I could hear the gears turning. He was thinking about the security systems on the boat. The isolation. The fact that on the water, no one hears a gunshot. On the water, the phrase-based voice-lock policy weakness could be exploited. He thought I was walking into his trap. He thought he could kill me there and dump the body in the Atlantic. "Fine. 0300. If you're late, I call the FBI." "I won't be late," I said. I ended the call. The connection severed with a soft digital click. I sat in the dark car for a moment, listening to the hum of the laptop fan. My hands were steady, but the tips of my fingers were cold. I rubbed them together, generating friction, generating heat. Rhodes had taken the bait. He thought he was the hunter luring a desperate prey into a cage. He didn't understand that the cage was where I did my best work. I closed the laptop. The red glow vanished, plunging me back into the darkness. I started the engine. It was time to go to sea. The yacht Sovereign was not just a boat. It was a floating nation-state. Docked at the end of the private pier, it gleamed white under the harsh halogen floodlights of the marina. It smelled of polished teak, salt water, and the faint, expensive scent of ozone coming from the radar array spinning silently on the mast. The water slapped against the hull with a rhythmic, indifferent thud. I stood at the end of the gangway, facing the entrance, my hands empty, my pockets empty, my posture open. I was not the hunter tonight. I was the offering. Master Chief Kane stood beside me, facing the entrance. He wasn't wearing his uniform or the grey hoodie from the bar. He was in a black tactical vest over a dark shirt private security detail. To the casual observer, he was escorting a guest. To the professionals watching from the bridge and the stern, he was bringing in a prisoner who hadn't been cuffed yet. His hand hovered near the small of his back, close to the Glock he had tucked there. It was theatre, but theatre with live ammunition. "Don't speak unless spoken to," Kane murmured. His voice was tight, a low vibration that barely travelled 3 feet. "And for God's sake, don't check your watch. If you look nervous, the sniper on the upper deck will put a round through your T-zone before I can stop him." I didn't look up. I didn't check my pulse, though I could feel it hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. 150, maybe 155. High, but steady. "I know the rules, Bronson. Just get me to the door." We stepped onto the gangway. The metal vibrated under our boots. I felt the eyes immediately. They were everywhere, shadows shifting near the lifeboats, the glint of a lens from the bridge, the stillness of a man smoking a cigarette by the aft lounge. These weren't standard rent-a-cops. They moved with the economy of Tier 1 operators. They stood too still. They watched with a predator's patience. We reached the first checkpoint, A man with a scar running through his left eyebrow stepped out, blocking the path. He didn't ask for ID. He held up a wand, a non-linear junction detector. He was scanning for electronics. My burner phone was in the car. My wire was non-existent. The only tech I had was the cloned NFC key in my shoe, shielded by a layer of copper foil I'd stripped from a coax cable. It was a gamble. If the wand picked up the chip, the night ended here, loudly. The wand hummed over my chest, my waist, my legs. It paused at my ankle. The man looked at me. I looked back, my face a mask of bored fatigue. I didn't hold my breath. Holding your breath increases CO2, triggers micro-tremors. I exhaled, slow and shallow. The wand moved on. Clear, the man grunted. He stepped aside. We moved deeper into the ship. The air changed. The salt smell faded, replaced by the recycled, sterile chill of aggressive climate control. We were inside the beast now. The carpet was thick, swallowing the sound of our footsteps. The lighting was low, recessed, designed to make billionaires feel cozy and intruders feel exposed. Every corridor was a choke point. Every door was a question. A microfear surged pulse spiked at the thought of a wrong move. One slip equals death, I whispered to myself. It wasn't a metaphor. If I tripped, if I reached for a pocket, if I made a sudden move that startled a jumpy mercenary, the rules of engagement allowed them to neutralize the threat. And I was the threat. Kane stopped at a heavy, polished mahogany door at the end of the main corridor. There was no handle, just a biometric scanner and a keypad. This was it. The SCIF, the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, a room designed to be a black hole for data. "He's in there," Kane said. He looked at me, and for a second the mask slipped. I saw the fear again, the knowledge that he was defying a man who could erase his existence. "You better be right about this, Vance, because there's no way off this boat for either of us if you're not." "Open it," I said. Kane typed a code. He pressed his thumb to the glass. The lock chirped a cheerful synthetic sound that felt obscenely out of place. The heavy bolts retracted with a solid thunk, thunk, thunk. The door hissed open, breaking the seal. I stepped through. The air inside was dead silent, damped by acoustic foam hidden behind silk wall panels. Senator Rhodes was sitting behind a desk that looked like it cost more than my father's house. He looked up, smiling. It was the smile of a man who thinks he has won. The door clicked shut behind me. The lock engaged. I was in the box. The room was a vacuum. The acoustic dampening in the SCIF was so effective, it felt like the air pressure had dropped. My own heartbeat sounded loud in my ears, a wet, thumping rhythm against the silence. Senator Clayton Rhodes sat behind a vast expanse of polished ebony, his hands resting on a leather folder. To his right, sitting casually on the desk surface, was a 6-hour P226. It was polished, clean, and pointed vaguely at my chest. "You have a lot of courage, Miss Vance," Rhodes said. His voice didn't echo. The room swallowed it instantly. "Or perhaps a lot of stupidity. It's a fine line." I stood 10 feet away, my hands clearly visible at my sides. I catalogued the room in a single sweep. No windows. One door. A server rack humming quietly in the corner, lights blinking in a chaotic pattern. That was the brain. That was where the ghost of my brother lived. "Courage is just a lack of options," I said. My voice was flat, steady. "I'm here to negotiate the terms of your surrender." Rhodes laughed. It was a dry, incredulous sound. He picked up the gun, weighing it in his hand. He didn't aim it yet. He just held it, a prop to underscore his authority. "Surrender? You walked into my facility, on my boat, surrounded by my men. You don't have a weapon, you don't have a wire, you have nothing." "I have the truth," I said. I took a step forward. He raised the gun slightly. I stopped. "And I have the file." Gabriel_log_01.enc. You saw it. I saw a file name, Rhodes sneered. A bluff. Lucas is dead. His files were scrubbed. Even if you had something, you couldn't open it. That server, he gestured with the gun barrel toward the humming rack, is biometrically locked to my voice print. Top secret encryption. The best money can buy. You seem very confident for a man who ordered a hit on a federal auditor, I said, pushing him. I needed him to speak. I needed specific words. I didn't order a hit, Rhodes corrected, his tone shifting to the lecture hall cadence of a politician explaining policy. I authorized a sanitization operation. There is a difference. When a limb is gangrenous, you cut it off. You don't ask the limb for permission. He paused, shifting his weight. So you admit it, I said. You gave the order to terminate the investigation. I gave the order to terminate a risk, he said, savoring the word. Yes, I did. I kept my face blank, but my right hand drifted imperceptibly toward my pocket, not to draw a weapon, but to mask the tiny LED indicator on my phone, which was currently in receive mode, recording high-fidelity audio, and you used your authority to cover it up. I have the authority to do whatever is necessary to protect this nation, Rhodes said, standing up. He was agitated now, his ego flared. I authorize strikes in countries you can't find on a map. Do you think I care about one dead auditor? And the sequence? I asked. The chain of events? You planned it all? The sequence was perfect, he spat. Until you interfered. Terminate. Authorize. Sequence. I had them. The 3 keywords for the voice print override. I didn't smile. I didn't blink. I simply reached into my pocket. Don't! Rhodes shouted, leveling the gun. Hands where I can see them. I'm just checking the time, I said. I pulled the phone out. I didn't look at it. I pressed the side button 3 times. The macro triggered. The phone blasted a high-gain audio file into the silent room. It wasn't my voice. It was his. Terminate, authorize, sequence. The words were chopped, remixed and amplified, but the frequency profile was identical. I held the phone toward the server rack. The lights on the server rack stopped their chaotic blinking. They turned solid amber. Then, with a cheerful ding, they turned green. The heavy magnetic lock on the server drive bay clicked open. Rhodes froze. He looked at the server, then at me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The gun wavered. What? What did you do? Replay, attack, I said. Your voice is your key, and you just gave it to me. Human pressure drove the victory, not just the gadget. On the server screen, a progress bar appeared. Uploading to cloud target. JAG_core_secure. Rhodes stared at the screen. The colour drained from his face. He raised the gun again, his hand shaking. Stop it. Stop it or I kill you. You can kill me, I said, watching the upload bar hit 20%. But the signal is already out. The packet is sent. Killing me just adds a body to the indictment. He pulled the hammer back. The click was deafening in the silence. The hammer of the pistol was pulled back. A mechanical click that sounded like the breaking of a small bone. Rhodes's hand was shaking, the tremor starting in his wrist and travelling up to the barrel, making the front sight dance. I didn't look at the gun. I looked at the server screen. The progress bar was a green line of inevitability. 40%? 45. The upload was packet switching through the encrypted tunnel I had built, bouncing off 3 satellites before hitting the JAG Core secure server in DC. It was math against ego. And math was winning. Cancel it, Rhodes whispered. His voice was no longer the smooth baritone of the Senate floor. It was thin, reedy, the sound of a man watching his legacy dissolve in real time. I will give you anything. Money. A pardon. I can make this go away. "You can't buy a packet stream, Senator," I said. My voice was low, clinical. I wasn't taunting him. I was stating a fact of network architecture. Once the handshake is complete, the file exists in 5 places simultaneously. You can shoot me, but you can't shoot the internet. Rhodes stared at me. The realization washed over him, the absolute crushing weight of consequence. He lowered the gun, not because he wanted to, but because he was an architect, and he knew when a structure was structurally unsound. Shooting me would turn a federal indictment into a murder charge. He dropped the weapon onto the desk. It clattered against the ebony wood, spinning once before coming to rest near his cufflinks. He sank into his chair, the leather creaking under the dead weight of his defeat. The upload bar hit 100%. Transmission complete. Outside, the world exploded into white light. Floodlights, harsh and blinding, cut through the darkness of the marina, illuminating the portholes of the SCIF. The sound of a megaphone cut through the hull, magnified by the water. "This is U.S. Military Police. Exit the vessel with your hands visible. The pier is secured." Rhodes looked at the porthole blinking against the glare. "You called them," he said, his voice dull. "I didn't call them," I said, picking up his gun and ejecting the magazine. I placed the empty weapon back on the desk. "The server did. It's an automated trigger linked to the biometric failure. You locked yourself in, Senator." I just turned on the lights. The automated incident reporting pipeline from the system flagged it earlier. The door to the SCIF hissed open. Master Chief Kane stood there. He wasn't alone. Behind him were 4 MPs in full tactical gear, their faces obscured by helmets, their posture radiating absolute lethal authority. They didn't shout. They didn't storm the room. They flowed in like oil, filling the space with the silent pressure of the state. A man in a dress uniform stepped through the phalanx of MPs. He wasn't shouting either. He held a folded document in his hand. The paper was heavy, cream-coloured, with the unmistakable embossed seal of the Judge Advocate General. "Senator Clayton Rhodes," the officer said. He didn't look at me. He looked only at the target. "I am executing a JAG warrant for your arrest under UCMJ authority. Conspiracy, misappropriation of classified assets, and solicitation of murder." Rhodes stood up. He tried to button his jacket, a reflex of dignity that looked pathetic in the face of the tactical team. "Do you know who I am? I sit on the Oversight Committee. This is a mistake." "The warrant is signed by the Secretary of the Navy, sir," the officer said. He didn't blink. He nodded to the MPs. "Secure him." 2 MPs moved forward. There was no struggle, just the metallic snick-snick of handcuffs engaging. Rhodes looked at me one last time as they turned him. His eyes were empty. The architect had been evicted. I walked out of the SCIF behind them. The corridor was lined with more MPs. No one spoke to me. No one offered me a hand. I wasn't a hero. I was just the witness who had lit the fuse. I stepped out onto the deck. The dawn was breaking over the Atlantic, a bruised purple line on the horizon. The air smelled of salt and diesel. On the pier, a crowd of marina staff and early risers had gathered, phones held up like votive candles, recording the fall of a Titan. I kept my head down. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I walked down the gangway, the metal vibrating under my feet. A hand touched my arm. It wasn't gentle. An MP steered me toward a black SUV waiting apart from the police cruisers. He got in. The door slammed shut, sealing me in silence. The detention facility at Little Creek was a study in sensory deprivation. The walls were painted a colour that wasn't quite white and wasn't quite grey, a hue designed by psychologists to induce passivity. The air was scrubbed, filtered, and chilled to 68 degrees, smelling of industrial cleaner and the faint, dry scent of photocopy paper. There were no windows. The only sound was the hum of the HVAC system, a constant, low-frequency drill that worked its way into the teeth. I sat at a metal table bolted to the floor. My hands were free, but they felt heavy, as if the phantom weight of handcuffs still lingered. It had been 4 hours since the yacht. I had been processed, fingerprinted, debriefed, and left to wait. I wasn't in a cell, but I wasn't free. I was in the grey zone, the purgatory reserved for assets who are too valuable to jail and too dangerous to release. The door opened. It wasn't an MP this time. It was a man in a crisp service uniform, the stars on his collar catching the fluorescent light. General Marcus Vance. My father. He looked older than the last time I had seen him. The lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by the grief he refused to speak aloud. He didn't rush to hug me. He didn't offer a smile. He walked into the room and sat opposite me, placing a file on the table. It was Lucas's service record, the red, classified stamp that had barred it from view for 2 years was gone, replaced by a restored stamp in blue ink. They accepted the findings, he said. His voice was gravel, steady, and unyielding. Lucas has been cleared. The pension is reinstated. His name goes on the wall at Langley. I looked at the file. I touched the edge of the paper. It was just paper, but it weighed as much as a tombstone. And Rhodes? Federal custody. He's cutting a deal, but his career is dead. The activity is burning his network to the ground as we speak. He paused, looking at me. His eyes were hard, assessing. He wasn't looking at his daughter. He was looking at an operator. You did good work, Sarah Messi. But good. I did what I had to do, I said. I balanced the ledger. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 small plastic cups and a flask. He poured a measure of amber liquid into each. Cheap whiskey. The kind Lucas used to drink before deployments. He slid 1 cup to me. To Lucas, he said. To Lucas, I whispered. We drank. The alcohol burned, a clean, sharp heat that cut through the sterile chill of the room. There were no tears. We didn't do tears. We did duty, and we did consequences. So, I said, setting the cup down. What happens now? Do I get a lawyer or a court-martial? Neither, he said. He closed the file. You're a civilian contractor who accessed a top-secret facility and utilized classified biometrics unauthorized. Technically, you're looking at 20 years in Leavenworth. Technically, I repeated. I knew that word. It meant there was a but. But, he continued, the activity has a shortage of people who can do what you did. Infiltrate, adapt, dismantle. He slid a second file across the table. It was black, thin, with no markings other than a single emblem embossed on the cover, a ghost. They don't want to prosecute you, Sarah. They want to hire you. I looked at the file. I looked at the walls of the room. I realized then that the cage hadn't disappeared. It had just expanded. I wasn't going to prison. I was going deeper into the shadow world that had killed my brother. I could walk out that door, but I would never truly be a civilian again. I was an asset now. The activity killed Lucas, now recruits her a moral price. I reached out and took the black file. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside. My new life. My sentence. My phone, sitting on the table where they had returned it to me, buzzed once. A single text message. Unknown sender. I looked at the screen. 3 words. Welcome home, Ghost.